Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Popular movies sometimes feature leagues of superheroes who are ready to defend the Earth against catastrophe. In this episode, we're going to be discussing some real-life superheroes, as chronicled in the new book by our guest, Tom Ough. The book is entitled The Anti-Catastrophe League, The Pioneers and Visionaries on a Quest to Save the World. Some of these heroes are already reasonably well known, but others were new to me and I suspect to many of the book's readers. Tom is a London-based journalist. Earlier in his career, he worked in newspapers, mostly for the Telegraph, where he was a staff feature writer and commissioning editor. He is currently a senior editor at UnHerd, where he commissions essays and occasionally writes them. Perhaps one reason why he writes so well is that he has a BA in English Language and Literature from Oxford University, where he was a Casberd scholar. Tom, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thanks for having me, gents. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Tom.
Tom, what made you take time out of your busy journalism career to research and write a book about the people trying to prevent global catastrophe?
At the point that I wrote the book, I had been out of newspapers. I quit the Telegraph in 2022, and then I spent some time working adjacent to some of the fields that I touched on. After a year of doing that, I felt I was sitting on quite a good amount of material, and so I started work on the book.
What were you researching in that time away from journalism?
For much of that time, I was working part-time for a philanthropic advice organisation that was interested increasingly as I worked there in emerging technologies like AI and pandemics, interested in mitigating the risks that those technologies might pose. After that, though, I did some research of my own. I did a report for an American think tank on novel methods of pandemic prevention. And I later did some research on cutting-edge geothermal and the US government's attempt to bring those into reality. And I did that for the Institute for Progress. It's a little on pandemics, a little bit on geothermal power.
Would you describe yourself as part of the effective altruism group, the philanthropic advice organisation? Sounds a bit like EA.
I probably would have when I was a student. And I was quite persuaded of the logic that we should all be doing more about curing malaria in the developing world and all that. As time went by, though, I went on to become a journalist instead of becoming a kind of professional EA. And I think it's important to maintain ideological distance between yourself and things that you're journalistically interested in. The organisation that I worked for from 2022 to 2023 was part of or adjacent to the EA scene. It didn't want to call itself EA. But for sure, it had loads and loads in common. So certainly much of my work has been informed by that time, as has the AI safety field in general.
EA has always struck me as being an eminently sensible idea at heart. Be philanthropic and make your philanthropic dollars go as far as they possibly can. There's nothing that you can really conceivably object to about that. It got itself a bad reputation thanks to Sam Bankman-Fried blowing up because he was one of its main advocates. And it all went very quiet for a while, but it seems to be coming back. I don't know if you've noticed, it's coming back in the form of consciousness studies, artificial consciousness. There's a lot of activity from EA people in that area at the moment.
Really? Well, I have seen overlap in those fields. As far as I'm concerned, open philanthropy has just been chugging away, unabated, just as it was during FTX. I don't know of a movement of people to the consciousness field, though I think that some of the kind of more woo-woo EAs had more interest in meditation and rationalist spirituality.
I suppose I may be suffering from salience because it's an area that I'm deeply involved in because I'm a co-founder of and David is an advisor to a company called Conscium, which one of our work streams is about artificial consciousness, whether it's coming, what the implications would be. And I do bump into EA people in that space. Probably not dozens and dozens because it's not that big a space, but quite a few.
EAs of a transhumanist bent.
Yeah. And David and I would probably say nothing wrong with that at all.
Let's take you back to geothermal, because it's not a topic we've covered much in this show before, and many people may wonder what's geothermal got to do with catastrophic risks. Is it that we're going to trigger a catastrophic risk by sticking something down into the subterranean vaults? Or is there lots of energy potentially available to tap into, which might avoid some of the risks of runaway climate change?
Well, I hope it's the latter, David. I wanted to include some work in the book on climate change. I wasn't very interested in things like solar because everyone knows about it and it's not necessarily going to fix the problem of supplying baseload power. But I have long been interested in geothermal power, which I think is very underrated. The premise is that the core of the Earth is very hot. The Earth actually remains very hot until you get quite close to the surface, such that if you can go 20 kilometers deep, the water that you pump down there will be under such pressure and be so hot that it has the energy density, it's said, of natural gas. Now, the problem is partly getting down there. It's mostly just keeping your pipes from melting and keeping your electronics from melting, that sort of thing, and reliably creating a system that circulates water. But if we can fix that, then suddenly we've solved baseload power. We don't need fusion if we can use geothermal. So I'm quite excited about it, even though governments don't spend much money on it, perhaps partly because of the tremors that geothermal projects have caused. So I devoted a chapter to this emerging field of cutting-edge geothermal. I think one reviewer said he couldn't quite muster the same boyish enthusiasm for it as I could, but readers can decide on their own, I think.
I think it fits into your general thesis that the way to avoid problems with too much dirty sources of energy currently isn't to ask us all to put on hair shirts and deny our use of energy. It's to come up with economically low-cost, high-quality energy on tap. Maybe that'll be nuclear fusion, but more likely it could be things like geothermal.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And of course, it's not a thesis original to me. There are lots of realists of this stripe who would say that degrowth is not going to work. I'm pretty convinced of that. Degrowth on its own would involve such a reduction in human welfare that I think it should be very far from the top of the menu, as it were, when it comes to choosing an approach to climate change. I also think that it's politically and socially infeasible. It would require very authoritarian, centralized world government to actually make it work and eliminate any free rider issues that it creates. Much more politically straightforward, I think, is just to find some way of making clean power cheaper than fossil fuels.
That does seem to be the case with solar and wind recently. More and more places are happy to switch over to using solar or wind because it is less expensive for at least some purposes than burning oil and gas.
Yeah, but you can't necessarily store a whole grid's worth of solar power in a battery over winter, right?
Well, I've been reading the recent book called Here Comes the Sun by
That famous climate scientist George Harrison.
by longtime climate writer Bill McKibben. But indeed, George Harrison does get a good plug in this book.
The best Beatle.
I think he's got a claim.
Yeah.
That's a very kind of consciousness view to hold.
Oh, do you think?
Yeah.
He was very woo.
Yeah.
He was the wooest of the lot.
I've got a lot of time for George Harrison. I think he produced actually some of the best post-Beatles work.
Definitely.
Well, at the very end of this book, Here Comes the Sun, McKibben does actually mention on Spotify there's a list of the most streamed Beatles songs of all time. And it's not Hey Jude or Yesterday, it's Here Comes the Sun, which is more than double the number of streams, astonishingly.
I think some of the big Beatles essayists look askance at that kind of stat. They view the Spotify listening public as not being true connoisseurs because Here Comes the Sun is basically like the least challenging Beatles song out there. But, I'm just glad people are listening.
So, Here Comes the Sun by Bill McKibben has almost persuaded me that actually batteries and grids are getting better faster than previously expected. 5 years ago, or whenever I read books by Bill Gates and others, they were quite clear batteries could never provide enough base storage. But McKibben seems convinced that there's new improvements in batteries the whole time, not just lithium batteries, but forthcoming sodium batteries and so on. So I think there's a wide range of possibilities. But I think it's also unwise to put our hopes too closely on just one or two technologies, which is why I really enjoyed seeing you exploring different approaches in your book.
Thanks, David. Yeah, the way it's been explained to me is that it's good to make a few bets at once rather than going all in on one technology and cheerleading for that, as perhaps we have with solar and wind.
Let's talk a little bit more about the sun, because one of the really fascinating chapters in your book was about coronal mass ejections and the possibility that if something happened to us in the next few years, similar to what seems to have happened in 1859, when the Carrington event took place, when at the time the primitive communications structures were damaged, if something similar were to happen to us today, there are some people who think it would be utterly catastrophic. Whereas others that you interview in your book say, well, it would be bad, but it wouldn't be the end of the world, and we'd be able to cope with it. What are your views on that?
Well, I always try to keep my own views at some removed from my reporting. I can't say they don't occasionally creep in. I won't claim either to be a solar scientist. For me, the interesting thing is that there seems to be some uncertainty scientifically over just how badly a solar storm could affect us, because the sun is roiling away constantly. We haven't been observing it closely for a particularly long time. And we've suddenly created this very interconnected world that relies on electronics and telecommunications, which solar storms do mess with. So the worry is that the sun might at some stage produce a coronal mass ejection, as they're called, large enough to cause havoc, bring down grids, and to do so in a way that would be much more hazardous than it might have been a few decades ago. Even our water supply, electricity is used in our water supply, and that's just one example of how electricity is used in like absolutely everything in a way that wasn't in the Victorian era. So you would have had a well back then, or something, or a horse, or all kinds of infrastructure that is now electronic. So that's the worry. But I don't personally have a well-formed take on what exactly to expect.
So it's appropriate to just share what you found and lead people into further exploring it and discussing it in more details. So perhaps we should have a future show that looks more fully at this risk or some other risks. But the follow-up question I have for you is, this is one risk that most people probably don't think too much about. Are there other things at the end of your research which still trouble you, which makes you worry? Well, actually, this is more precarious than most people understand. Really, more people in the world should be paying attention to such and such a risk.
Yes, I think there are lots of things to worry about. It does seem that the initial fears about AI haven't transpired yet in the way that the biggest pessimists thought they would. But it's also a technology that is evolving quickly, and I think really could make the world unrecognizable within our lifetimes, with all kinds of ramifications for safety that I couldn't possibly begin to describe because it's so difficult to imagine. I'd also cite pandemics. Just before I finished the book, some scientists publicly disclosed the existence of a thing called mirror life, which is a way of physically inverting the structures of, I think, viruses and bacteria. I'm sure I'm hopelessly mangling the science here, but the worry is that some renegade scientist, perhaps in 10 years or so, might be able to do this physical inversion of RNA or DNA on their own or in a small group. And then some kind of inverted cold virus slips out and our immune systems won't know what to do with it. That sort of thing does make me worry.
Can I just dig in on that for a second? This sounds like Tenet, the Chris Nolan movie. How is being inverted a threat to non-inverted life?
I should clarify something first, which is that I think that there was some public work on it. There's a PR group that will chase me up if I get this wrong. So I think it was sort of in public before, but there's been more public exposure of it recently. But as to your question, I'm not an immunologist. So again, I'm sure I'm going to butcher it, but my understanding is that immune systems respond to the physical structure. So if it's flipped the wrong way around, it's unfamiliar to them. And then suddenly you have no defense against this cold virus or whatever it is. Maybe some virus that attacks crops or something.
So there is some research which we can link to from Wikipedia and other places, Louis Pasteur apparently first speculated on the possibility of this. We never found any such mirror life, but if it was made, these scientists, including Nobel laureates, warned that if it was created, it could cause unprecedented and irreversible harm to human health and ecosystems worldwide. That's in December 2024, which I guess is when you were winding up your book.
Yeah, that was right at the end of the writing process. I was like, no, not another catastrophe. So I had to do some hurried insertions.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Now in its 5th season, Inspiring Tech Leaders is the podcast that talks about technology strategies, challenges and breakthroughs shaping today's digital world. Each week, Inspiring Tech Leaders brings you technology reviews and interviews with visionary CIOs, CTOs and industry pioneers. Whether you're leading a tech team or just love innovation, Inspiring Tech Leaders is your go-to source for inspiration and real-world advice. Subscribe now on your favourite podcast platform.
And again, as you say, people have different opinions on this. Other people say we are being prematurely worried about it. There's no need to cause a panic. Indeed, generally, I would say panicking is not the appropriate response to any of these risks. But we do want people to be more serious about them. And the risk is, as you said, that somebody who is more capable in the future, who has more access to more tools in the future, perhaps with the help of AI in the future, to guide them to do things that are just beyond their capabilities, they could create something like a new pandemic, something like a mirror-life bacteria, which then would have much more bad impact than was previously expected. So how are we for pandemic preparedness? You said you were working on this for a while. If something like that were to happen, would we stumble and make a mess of things again? Or are we in a better shape now to respond more quickly?
I think it depends on the pandemic. If it were somehow related to mirror life or something that attacked crops, then I'm not sure how well we would fare. It's difficult to know whether we're much better at handling pandemics than we were 5 years ago. I know that stuff like wastewater monitoring has improved, but I don't think that ability is pretty widely distributed. So although the technology seems to work, it's not in every bit of plumbing in the world. I think people have been working on improved PPE, but again, the existence of that PPE is not the same as everyone having their own bit of PPE in a cupboard somewhere, just in case. So as far as I know, the jury is out.
I would have thought the biggest change, which is a really bad change, is the virtual dismantling of the CDC in America. Even though Robert Kennedy Jr. doesn't seem quite able to decide whether he is an anti-vaxxer or not, he has removed a lot of the people who were leading experts in pandemics, and America has lost a huge amount of capability, and America is the place that we all rely on in many ways.
Yeah, I think that's pretty worrying too, as might be the public mistrust of further lockdowns. Now a consensus seems to be forming that we locked down a bit too hard with some social effects that we didn't anticipate. And I think that would make it very hard for Western governments to tell the public yet again that it's time for another lockdown, time for many months behind closed doors. I just don't think the public would adhere to it.
I'm sure that's right. At the time, we didn't know what was the right thing to do. And having a heavy lockdown was not a stupid thing to do anyway, even if it has turned out to be probably, in hindsight, too severe. But the public trashing of healthcare professionals by people in powerful positions has been incredibly unhelpful, as you say.
I think this touches on the broader point that there are some features of society which, if they work well, will help us to adapt to any of the risks as they become more apparent. But if they're not working well, then they'll mean that we just run around like headless chickens, chasing one conspiracy theory after another, rather than actually tackling them with a true scientific approach. So I think, as well as talking about the individual threats, we have to talk about what makes society resilient, what makes society able to understand threats more broadly. Part of that is surely that there are books which set things out. Part of it's also that there are institutions that are trying to help us to think and prepare for the future. And that brings me to ask you about the Oxford FHI, Future of Humanity Institute, which features quite centrally in parts of your book. So it was an institution that seemed to be focusing on catastrophic risks and solutions to them, and it's gone out of business, or it was shut down under a bit of a cloud last year. So I wonder, how do you assess the FHI? Was it a success? Was it a failure or was it something in between?
Could equally ask you, David. I'm sure you had your dealings with it over the years.
I really enjoyed going to the first Catastrophic Risk Conference in perhaps 2008 or 2009, when I met Eliezer Yudkowsky for the first time and listened to lots of fascinating talks about whether CERN was risking blowing up the universe by its reckless high-energy experiments. So I thought it was doing great guns at that stage, but there's nothing much left. I was in Oxford a couple of nights ago. Normally I would have met people from the FHI, but there's nobody left there. Is that a shame? I think it's not a complete disaster because some of the ideas have gone elsewhere, and we should always expect organizations to unform and reform in different ways. But I feel it's a shame that these ideas are no longer at the heart of Oxford University.
Yeah, I think Oxford has set up some sort of replacement, but it seems to be much more rooted in traditional philosophy than FHI was. Some of the staff of FHI have, I think, got part of the old bands back together at maybe it's Forethought. It is a shame it's disbanded. It produced a lot of interesting work. Of course, it's gone on to seed subfields of its own, like AI safety as an empirical endeavour. But yeah, I do think it was a great shame that it's gone.
What was the cloud that it was closed under?
Well, it wasn't fully clear from the outside, but my understanding after doing quite a lot of reporting on it was that it was always an uneasy fit in the philosophy department, which it kind of was housed by and grew out of and became much larger than. It was an uneasy fit because the work they were doing was, in the eyes of the philosophy faculty, kind of fantastical and not properly rooted in traditional philosophy, and perhaps a bit disreputable at times. I think Nick Bostrom, who ran FHI, would probably admit himself to not being the most diligent diplomat with the university. So they had a reputation of not being compliant with all the bureaucratic procedures that are asked of university departments. And the university, I think, some years was imposing measures on them like hiring freezes, which made it very hard to maintain headcount. I think it wasn't properly disbursing money that had been donated to FHI. So the institution was kind of semi-throttled, a much smaller version of its original form by the time it was shut down in March last year.
It's funny that it took them 10 years or more, well, actually, I think nearly 20, to shut it down. Bostrom produced the book Superintelligence in, I think, 2014 or thereabouts, which was enormously seminal. Perhaps it could be more clearly written, but an enormously important book and got loads of people interested in the space. You would think if the more established philosophers were going to protest and find that what it was doing was disreputable, that would have been the time to do it. It's amazing that they waited 10 years to shut him down, although perhaps that's how philosophers are. They're not the fastest movers, are we?
Yeah, who knows? The bureaucratic machinations were unclear to me even after speaking to quite a lot of people about it.
My takeaway is that it's a reminder that human relations are always important in building organizations. Brilliant ideas help, good tools help, but in the end, these human personal relationships are vital too. Nick was a brilliant thinker, but he didn't particularly prioritize the human side of management. He left a lot of the others to get on by themselves, which sometimes works, but sometimes you need somebody to do the executive director stuff.
Did you read his next book, the follow-up one?
Deep Utopia.
Deep Utopia.
Have you seen that, Tom?
Yeah.
Did you find it a worthy successor to Superintelligence?
I thought it was very interesting. Read in a hurry while I was researching, so I again be interested in your opinion, which I suspect will be more fully formed.
I don't know about more fully formed, but I'm quite prepared to be blunt. I think Bostrom is a complete genius. Superintelligence is a terrific book. Deep Utopia struck me as being deeply weird, and I couldn't see the point of it at all. The allegorical stories that are threaded through it, I never understood what that was about. And the stories about him as a lecturer in the university and then the big power cut. It was weird. It was like there were three strands from different books, and they'd all been brought together unnecessarily in one book. And then there was another bit missing. I just didn't understand it at all. But that may say more about me.
It reminds me of Gödel Escher Bach. this brilliant piece of work from the 1970s, which there are multiple layers all dipping into each other, but it did add up to more than the individual parts, whereas...
And that was supposed to be an anthology. It was wearing its disparateness on its face.
So let's follow up the discussion about the Future of Humanity Institute, because one thing that they set in motion is the AI safety initiatives, which led to Britain temporarily leading the world with its Bletchley Park Summit in 2023. You had access to some of the behind-the-scenes hard human work, as well as the tools and so on, just what I was talking about, the importance of human work. Do you think, in retrospect, that Britain did well there, and that's something we should be building on?
Yeah, I think so. Someone's got to lead the safety work. I think it's a shame that that's our only niche within AI at the moment. But yeah, sure. I think it was good that we did the summit.
And has your view changed? You said in the beginning you thought that maybe some of the AI threats people were concerned about before seem to have receded, that people were very anxious back in the Bletchley Park days, but some people seem to be less anxious nowadays than before. Is this just people breathing out too quickly?
Well, it's difficult to say, isn't it? I'm aware that people's timelines have lengthened slightly, and it does seem that so far, to get an AI model to behave badly, you do need to put it under quite a lot of duress. As I've said, it's really, really early days, but perhaps we're not in the worst possible paradigm. That's probably as far as I would go. But I'd be interested in... Can I just flip it around for like the third time? David, what do you think?
Well, I am worried because I see that some of the tests of these systems are indicating the willingness of AIs to deceive and tell lies if they believe they're going to be shut off, and that to a certain extent AIs don't want to be shut off.
Yeah.
Some people say, well, AIs ought to discover that love is the most important thing in the universe and collaboration is the most important thing in the universe. They anthropomorphize to that extent. I think self-preservation is one of the most important things. And if anything has a kind of agency, it will want to preserve itself. And if it detects that it's likely to be shut off, it's not surprising that it will take actions to try and escape. So these recent results are worrying. It's a canary signal, and we should be listening to that canary signal.
Yeah, I certainly think that we should be taking this stuff very seriously, given the likelihood of there being much more powerful models in the medium term.
And there does still seem to be significant progress. Every few weeks there is an interesting new result. So back in July, there were the 2 bits of software that did remarkably well in the International Mathematical Olympiad, both of them reaching gold level, which had never been done before. Indeed, 4 years ago, it was expected it would take up to 10 years for that stage to be reached. They're not yet at the stage of solving all 6 International Mathematical Olympiad problems comprehensively. Both the software from Google's DeepMind and similar software from OpenAI, both of them got good answers to 5 of the 6 questions. 1 or 2 of the humans got 6 answers to 6 questions. So AI is not yet outperforming the best humans, but it's getting close. If AIs can do mathematics, shouldn't be too long before it's coming up with new physics, in my view. And maybe we'll have the solution to why there are 2 different Hubble constants, what dark matter is or isn't. I think it's reasonably possible we'll have that in 3 or 4 years, and that would be wonderful. But at the same time, if other people are using that AI to design Mirror Life or anything else to get their revenge on the world, and we are living in a time when a small number of people really do want to get their revenge, they feel they're being left behind, AI stirring up their emotions, I think we have to address this as never before.
I don't disagree.
I heard an interesting comment the other day that people had been slightly misled about GPT-5. The launch by OpenAI was such a clusterfuck. It was such a misbegotten affair that people said, it's not so different from 4.0. But actually, it's really different. It hallucinates an awful lot less. And as David was just saying, the mathematical achievements, 4.0 couldn't do very much maths. And this thing is as good as maths professors. So the rate of progress is very fast. And just recently, there might have been a pulling back of timelines from the exuberance of Leo Aschenbrenner and also was it Project 2027, where people said we'll have AGI by 2027. But still, it's noteworthy that the leaders of big AI, Sam Altman, Demis Hassabis, and Dario Amodei, are all still saying, as far as I know, that we'll have superintelligence or may have superintelligence by the end of the decade. I personally suspect that's a little bit too optimistic or pessimistic, depending on your outlook. But it's remarkable that people in those positions think it's that soon. Really quite remarkable.
Well, they're incentivized to say this stuff, right? I'm certainly not one of these people who is saying that AI is like a total joke, snake oil, and never change the world.
You're not in the Gary Marcus camp.
Well, Gary Marcus doesn't say that either. Gary thinks that AGI can come, but it won't come via large language models.
He's been pulling his timelines forwards, but he's still pretty skeptical, isn't he?
I'd probably be more concerned about people like Geoffrey Hinton ringing the alarm bell, which he has, because he hasn't got as big a financial stake in people generally thinking AI is about to change the world.
Yeah, I was at a conference the other day, and somebody said everybody who's raising issues, they're doing it for financial motivations. And my counterexample was Geoffrey Hinton, because he was in a very well-paid job at Google, and he stepped away from it in order to raise his alarm. So he's one counterexample. Yoshua Bengio also has resisted taking any significant funding from big tech, and so he maintains his academic independence. He's motivated by citations and by the good of humanity rather than how much money he's going to earn.
But I find the idea that the leaders of big tech, the people I mentioned before, are incentivized to overstate how soon we're going to get to superintelligence, given that most people think superintelligence is an existential risk. Their incentive is to say, no, that's not going to happen for centuries. In the meantime, we're going to solve healthcare and we're going to solve education. I find this idea that Sam Altman and others are talking about superintelligence in order to distract us all from the terrible sins and crimes that they're perpetrating around privacy and bias. I find that a really bizarre argument.
We'll have to agree to disagree on that. It's in the interest of every startup founder to hype up what they're doing to say it's on the cusp of changing the world. I don't see why this is different.
Because the change in the world might be the end of the world. There's not much incentive for a CEO to say, I'm developing this terrific product, and for the next 3 years, it's going to improve healthcare, and after that, it's going to kill us all. I don't see how that's part of their incentive package.
Yeah, I think when they say this stuff, it's genuinely held. But I think the better bellwether is someone like Geoffrey Hinton.
Fair enough.
My final question, Tom, is if you're going to write another book, do you know what it will be about? Or are you going to put more of your creative efforts into other projects, such as your own podcast, Anglo-Futurism?
Yeah, well, I do have this podcast, which I'm enjoying working on. It's difficult to imagine finding space for another work of nonfiction when I'm very happy doing my journalism with UnHerd and goofing around in my spare time on this podcast, which is about exciting British future. I don't think that books are as compelling a medium as they used to be. One reason is that the world is moving fast and books move slowly. Another reason is that people just don't read as many of them as they used to. So that dampens my enthusiasm somewhat for doing another. But I wouldn't rule it out. I think I'll probably do one at some stage. But it has to be the right project at the right time.
I think people don't read as many books, but they do get GPT-5 to summarize them for them, and then they probably consume as much that way. I'm curious to know a bit more about Anglo-Futurism, because I've read that it involves thatched space stations and spoons on the moon. Is that true?
Yeah, we actually record our own podcast in a pub that is famously thatched. So guests get invited up there and we sort of float around and ask them questions. Anglo-Futurism is a sort of memeplex based on that idea. Some of them more twee, some of them more impish and edgy. But fundamentally, I would say it's a sort of irreverent, optimistic view of what Britain might be. In fact, it's some departure from this EA-like work that I was doing because it's quite partial to Englishness and Britishness, even if it is technologically inspired in some ways.
Well, please tell us more about the exciting British future that you have in mind, because most people nowadays are quite pessimistic about the future of Britain.
Well, it's not that I'm not pessimistic. I think a lot of things are going very badly wrong, and I think that might be partly why at least a few people are interested in the podcast. I think Britain has a lot of potential despite everything. We still have lots of talent. We have a track record of being successful for a long time. We have resources available to us, which other countries don't. These are the kind of supporting reasons for my optimism, basically, even if I wouldn't necessarily bet every pound I have on all the fantastic dreams of Anglo-futurism coming to pass.
I suspect I might know the answer to this, Tom, but do you think there's an exciting future for the UK outside the EU, or do you think we should accept that the experiment failed and go back and try to make the world multipolar by boosting the EU?
Well, I did vote Remain in 2016, though I now think that I was wrong. I think that the EU is so clearly sclerotic that much as I would like it to be the case that the EU works out and supports the prosperity of everyone who lives in it, I think we're probably better off outside. And that's a very long-term view. I appreciate that in the short term we've put up trade barriers, but I look at the EU and I think that's not an economy that I want to be part of in 20 years.
It's very splendidly contrarian of you to go in that direction. To have started off as a Remainer and become a Brexiteer by dint of experience. There's not much traffic in that direction.
There are many such cases, I think. Many such cases.
It's out of an observation that the EU is struggling to be nimble enough in the world, that it's got processes that were defined for a particular set of issues, and as the EU is scaled up, as it's tried to become a unified financial enterprise, it's run into more and more problems.
Yeah.
I don't know that's at all fair. The problem with the EU isn't that it's bureaucratic or slow, it's that it isn't a done deal. We don't have a really good single market. The EU has performed miracles. For a start, it stopped the Germans and the French fighting, and that is civilization level important. Secondly, it has raised the living standards of people in the south of Europe enormously. Thirdly, it has made some progress towards making Europe a single market, and that is Europe's biggest problem. It can't compete with America and China because it's not a single market. It isn't a case that there's too much regulation. It's a case that the regulation isn't complete and doesn't create a proper single market. There's just no chance of Italy, Spain, Britain individually creating big tech companies, for instance, as one sign of competing in the modern world alone. That can only happen at a European level.
But what about something like DeepMind? What if we kept that?
But we couldn't, and we haven't. We didn't, and we couldn't. It's American.
If we were in the EU?
If we were in the EU, and if the EU had succeeded in allocating much more of its capital base to private companies and to venture, which could happen, then you might have a capital base which should enable something like DeepMind to remain European. As it is, it's virtually impossible for a company like DeepMind to remain European. It has to become American, because that's where the capital is.
The EU that you're envisaging would be great, but it's not the EU we have, unfortunately. The EU that was more democratically responsive would be great, but unfortunately, again, that's not the EU Commission that exists.
No, because it's an unfinished project, and who knows, maybe Trump is demonstrating clearly enough to Europeans that they really do need to create their own defense industry, and they really do need to create their own AI industry, and they really do need to complete the single market. He hasn't finished providing scares. It's partly working because the EU is now creating a defense industry. That is happening. It isn't yet creating an AI industry. I dare say he will continue to create scares because that's what he does. So maybe he will not only make China great again, but also make Europe great again.
My intuitions have changed on this, but I think there's lots to admire about the intuitions of people who like the EU and wish we're still in it.
I think this underscores the point I was trying to make earlier, which is that for the beneficial future for humanity, we need to fix some of our institutions and human relationships, as well as just get better technology. Technology will certainly help. Cheap solar energy, cheap geothermal energy, but it's going to be held up if the markets aren't working well and if regulations are fragmented and there's too much suspicion rather than ability to work. That's my excuse, dear listeners, for letting this conversation run into quite tricky territory. But I think we can't expect to build a better world unless we have careful thoughts about these political and social issues as well.
I think we should welcome running into tricky territory. It makes the podcast much more interesting.
Well, thanks, Tom, for being part of this conversation.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Callum, as well. It's been very enjoyable sparring and speaking with you.
Thanks for joining us, Tom. It was good fun.